Hey everyone, it's Lee Halliday, and this video it's time for some experimental stuff. We're going to be trying out gqless, a GraphQL client without queries. And what it's supposed to allow you to do is basically just access properties. The library converts those into GraphQL queries. So you're basically avoiding this whole step of writing GraphQL queries yourself, sort of telling Apollo or Urkel or whatever to go off and execute that statement. It sort of does it all sort of behind the scenes without you really knowing what's happening. But I thought we tried it out. It's very experimental. If you just go look at the GitHub repo, for example, you can see it's got a ton of stars, 2.2K. It was mentioned in React status and whatnot, but very few people actually using it right now. Oh, sorry, that's the watch. Normally there's another one that shows you how many people are using it. Anyways, I think it's like 15 repositories are using it right now. So very little sort of real world usage. But why don't we try it out, see what I like, what I don't like, whether I would use this or not over Apollo if I were to sort of build a new production application. And let's take a look. So I've got a create React app right now. It's just saying the word app, so pretty basic. I've got this open in my code editor, and I'll show you the setup that you need to do to be able to use gqless if you want to try it out in your own project. So if we go into the package JSON, I have already installed the 3 packages you need to use this. So the first one is gqless, and you can even tell it's super alpha by the version. But you need gqless. You'll need @gqless React to be able to use this inside of your React application. And you'll also need this dev dependency gqless CLI, because you're going to need to generate some code that basically goes up to your GraphQL schema and generates types and all of this sort of proxy structure that behind the scenes gqless uses to figure out what properties you're accessing to go off and execute those GraphQL queries. So the first thing you do is you install these deps, and now we need some config so gqless knows where to go and pull down your GraphQL schema from. So we can do that by adding gqless as a new attribute in our package.json file, and we'll need to give it 2 things. We'll need to give it a URL, and we'll need to give it an output directory, output dir. So basically when it generates the code, where is it going to place it? We'll say to put it in src GraphQL. And we'll pop open this. So what GraphQL API are we going to be playing with? Is this api.spacx.land/GraphQL. It's basically a way to access some data about some past launches that SpaceX has done. So I've got a GraphQL query here that we're going to be reproducing using gqless. So it grabs the last 10 launches, gets the mission name, what the rocket was, and then what ships were used. I think that's where the rockets come down and land on the ocean. So it grabs an array of ships, and you can see the data over here on the right. So we've got Starlink 5 was the mission, the rocket, the ships, of course I Still Love You, along with an image, etc. So this is what we're using. So we'll just go and copy this URL. Go paste it over here in our URL like that. And the next thing we need to do is, well, you don't need to do this, but we're going to add a script called generate. And it's going to call gqless. And then it has a script you can run called generate. So we'll just go down to the console. And now we can run yarn run generate like this. And while this is generating, it's done already, hey, but I should mention that you definitely need TypeScript to be able to work with gqless. It generates you files that are all TypeScript, so for you to be able to use them, you need that. So I've gone ahead and I've added sort of a TS config that I had on some old Create React app application that used TypeScript, because otherwise you can't use this. I had to say strict false because when I had strict 2, it was giving me some TypeScript build errors. So if you run into that issue, you'll probably need to set this to false. And it has generated all of this folder here. So let's take a look at what's included in it. We'll start off with the index. It's importing from something called generated and something called client. So the first thing I asked myself when I was looking through these documentation, the docs on this website, is like, how do you customize the client? Like, how do you tell it where to go point to perform the GraphQL queries? How do you override headers? Because often you have to set up like an authorization header to be able to do like OAuth authentication and whatnot. Maybe you need to pass up some other stuff. I didn't know how to do that. And there isn't really anything in here that you'll find to be able to figure that out. So I looked through the whole thing, read pretty much every page, couldn't find it. And then I generated the code and I went into client. And what I found, it's actually not, I think that's because I had deleted the code I was playing with before. If I just restart code, it should probably fix itself. We'll see. Okay, I think we're good now. So it generated all of this for me. And what it does is it generates you a function, an async function called the fetch query function. It exports it, or it uses it within the client that it exports. But this is simply just fetch, the same one that is used within your browser. So the endpoint it got from our configuration that we set up in package.json. And you can just customize this here. So if you wanted to set up some authorization bearer token to be able to send up your authorization, you'd probably have to read this from like a cookie or local storage or something like this. But anything you need to do in here, you can just tweak. And then it's sending up the GraphQL as JSON with the query and the variables. And then it's waiting for the response and it just returns this data. So you can do sort of like any customization in here that you want to. So what else did it create? It created this generated folder. In here, thank goodness you don't have to type this yourself because it's like 4,000 lines of code. But basically it generated this big schema data structure of getters that are basically gqless uses this to, I think it uses proxies under the hood to be able to see what attributes you're accessing. And it builds that up and it executes the query that we'll see in a second. The cool thing about this, it's all fully typed. It basically looks at your GraphQL types and it generates TypeScript types based on all of that. So you can see here like a user, what do we got here? User has these fields, limit, which is a number, but you can pass, it's optional, so you could be undefined and null. So it builds all of your types for you, so that's pretty cool. And it gives you extensions that we'll look at later for you to be able to customize or add different functions or attributes to different GraphQL types. So why don't we start to actually use this thing? The first thing you're going to want to do is set up Suspense. This library uses Suspense to sort of, if it's taking too long for the API to respond, it uses the Suspense, what's it called, timeout or fallback, I think it's called. So we'll set up Suspense here, and for now we'll just have it say app still, and we'll give it our fallback. So this is a component to display if the Suspense was triggered, and basically if the API was taking too long. So here we can just say loading, very slow, sorry. Save that. So let's start our app and we'll go up here and it should still say app. Make this a little bigger. Cool. So we're going to pop open the network tab and specifically we'll filter out for just the GraphQL request to see when they're made. So how do you actually start using this library? We are going to import two things. The first thing is we are going to import query from GraphQL. So basically, GraphQL is this folder here, index, it's exporting everything from client. Client was exporting this property called query. So this is basically where you start when you're accessing data that will eventually perform a query. And the other thing we need is a function that we'll use as a higher order component from gqless React, like that. So we're going to create a new component and we'll call it launches. So we'll just make it an arrow function. And right now we'll just return, why don't we just say launches like that. So we're going to wrap this GraphQL function around our component here, like that. And then we should use our component inside of Suspense. So launch, self-closing, launches, like that. And come back here, and now we're seeing launches. We can see it's still not performing any GraphQL. So let's get it to start triggering some GraphQL. So remember, if we go over to the Explorer, I wanted to get the past 10 launches, and we'll just start with the ID and the mission name. So we'll come back here to our code, and inside of launches, so typically here is where you'd use you'd write your query above, like const query, GQL, etc. And then inside of your component, you'd use use query hook or something like that with Apollo. So the difference with gqless is that you basically just come in here and you say query dot launches past. And it's cool because it's all TypeScripted based code generation based on your schema. It's all showing up. So we can come here and we can see what it wants us, what we can pass. So what did we want? Limit 10. So we'll get the last 10. And this will return us an array, so we'll map them. And now we have each of the launches. So why don't we just do that with a div inside. And we will put inside of an h2 the launch dot mission name, like that. Okay, and because we're mapping, we need a key, so we'll do launch.id, like that. And prettier, fixed my bad indentation. And we'll come back here, and now we can see a list of all of the launches, or the last 10, which is pretty cool. We can go into our network tab, and we can take a look, and we can see this is the query it's performing. So launches passed, limit 10, asking for the ID and the mission name fields, and we never had to write any GraphQL ourselves. So as soon as you sort of access properties or attributes, and then you can map them, there's some craziness going on behind the scenes that I have no clue how it works. I think it's using Babel along with proxies and to basically lazy, I don't even know, I don't want to get into it because it's beyond my skill level, we'll say. But that's what it's doing. If you remove mission name here and just show the ID, come back here, it will no longer be asking for the mission name. So why don't we just build this out a little bit more? Mission name. We will, below here, we will let's put a UL. And in the UL, we'll get the launch ships, and we'll map them. So each ship will map to an LI. The LI will have a key, so we'll do the ship.id. And inside of the LI, we'll do an H3 that has the ship.name. So save that. I saw for a second our suspense, but now you can see that we've got a list of all the ships for each one. And it's updating the query to ask for ships and the ID and the name of each ship. And we could put an image below. Let's check if it has an image first, because maybe it doesn't. So we'll say ship.image. If that's truthy, we'll put an image tag that uses the ship.image. And we'll give it an alt. So that will just be ship.name, we'll say. Else we'll do null for no image. And beautiful. It's showing them super big. Let's just add some inline styles. Let's just say width is 200 pixels. It's not like in this. What did I do wrong? Oh, it's not SRC, it's style. Cool. So here we go. We've got a list of the ships along with the images from the GraphQL API without writing any GraphQL ourselves. The next thing I wanted to look at is how would you add a custom sort of function for this? Say if you click the LI, so on click, you want to run there's a function that will be called on that event, and you want to do something called like a clicked function, for example. So this doesn't exist, right? This is where we can go into extensions, and what we can do is you export a new variable that matches the type of the GraphQL type that you're working with. So this is an arrow function that will receive an object of some sort. It's not super clear what it is. And this is where you can sort of extend the functionality and add a clicked function. And all we're going to do is sort of follow the example, follow the example above and console log out the ship name. So we'll just put console.log and we'll do ship.name. Or we could, why don't we say alert, just so we can see it without switching over to the console. So I come back here, I click this, nothing's happening. So I obviously screwed up somehow. Oh, didn't save the file. So I click this, I see of course I still love you. It didn't trigger an additional GraphQL query, I think because I already had the name. But let's see if we asked for something on the ship. Where's the Explorer? What else does a ship have? It has a model. Cool. So let's alert the model instead and see what happens to our query. So model. Come back here, I'll click it, null. So this is where I would say I'm not the biggest fan of this library in that it hides a lot of what I would say is like, it tries to make it easier by hiding complexity, but in my mind it just makes things more difficult because you don't really know what's going on behind the scenes. So somehow, like it had model is not available on the ship. And if we just console.log out, like what is this ship and what can I access on it? So if I were to look in the console, so it's a proxy and it's got like basically what is this ship thing that I'm receiving? And this is where I sort of started to get confused and wonder, is this thing actually worth it? Like maybe if and I'm totally just riffing right now, if I were to come in here and add the model somewhere inside of here, and now I click it, see now it has access to the model because it was previously queried. But here's where I'm not really quite sure how to access properties, say inside the clicked that weren't available, or maybe I shouldn't be accessing that. But how do I know what's been queried? I'd have to go out and look at my view code to see sort of what's been accessed and what I have available to me. So anyways, it's cool that you can add that functionality, but it's a little bit tricky, like what's available. Maybe I won't even get into it. Maybe if I were to access model here. No, but it's going to complain. Anyways, let's leave that alone. So the next sort of gotcha that I ran into is they have an ability to poll. So it's sort of every, say, 5 seconds to re-execute the query so you can see up-to-date information. So I thought, okay, well, maybe every 5 seconds, I know launches aren't changing, but imagine it was weather, stock market ticker, or something like that. Every 5 seconds, I want it to go execute all of this query again, refetch this whole thing. So I imported use poll, and you say use poll, and you pass sort of the data that you want to query. So I thought kqueries.launch is passed, and you give it an interval, let's say every 10,000 milliseconds, so 10,000. We come back here and we look at the GraphQL calls, and in 10 seconds it will perform another query. Sorry for making you wait so long, I should have made it less. Cool. So we come down and let's look at what it executed. And it literally didn't ask for anything. It just asked for launches past type name. And if we even go to the original, it did two queries. So it did the one that sort of this limit 10 with asking for the mission, but it also asked the one with just the type. So here is where you need to like limit 10. And I basically didn't know where to go from here. Like, how do I write like that I want the, would you do? No, I don't even know how to do it, but like, how would I tell it to go ask for the ID and the mission name? Maybe it's possible. I just couldn't figure it out. Looking through the examples and whatnot, I was a bit lost. I also got stuck using the use variable. This is basically, say I wanted to put 10 into a variable, so the user could sort of ask for more or less. You're supposed to be able to say const, sort of limit and set limit, and it looks very much like the use state hook, use variable. And you could give it an initial value of say 5. And I started running into TypeScript errors here. It was saying type variable is not an array type. Couldn't figure it out because this is the exact example basically used. And so I stopped. So basically my conclusion with this is that it's a really cool concept, and I'm interested to see where this library is going to go, but I'm not sure I totally am on board with what it's trying to accomplish. It's trying to sort of provide you this abstraction layer so you can just go in and interact with your data, and it takes care of all of the sort of behind the scenes stuff. So imagine if anyone's familiar with Ruby on Rails, you've got active record and you access its properties, and maybe you access a relationship and it goes and makes another query to the database. And it's that sort of thing, but if things are too abstracted, I find that I kept going into the network and trying to figure out what the heck's this library actually doing behind the scenes. There was also some issues around, well, how do mutations work? I don't think those are supported yet. And I came up with a list of them, sort of things I liked, interesting concept, avoid double declaration, basically avoid the query to get your data and then the data getting yourself. You don't have to do that at all, you just access the data. Types are supported outside of the box. That was awesome. You just type and it shows you what's available. But here's what the issues I had. I wrote them down. I found myself constantly looking at what's actually being sent to the server. It's very bleeding edge. There's not a ton of examples, community support. This is an alpha release, so I think this will get better. I wasn't sure what's with mutations, subscriptions. I was running into TypeScript errors with variables, polling. I couldn't run it in strict mode. It was giving errors with the generated types, so not even something I was doing myself. And if you're not using TypeScript, you can't use this at all. So I think at the end of the day, even though this library says it's production ready, we'll say that right here in a second, production ready. I don't really know that it is production ready yet, but it's a very interesting concept, and kudos to the person who came up with this, because they're a way better programmer than I am to figure out all of this stuff. But I think I would agree with this article that Marc-Andre, who's a guy I follow, he knows a ton about GraphQL, works at GitHub. He reviewed this library and his conclusion was similar, that it might not be worth the sort of the fuss and the difficulty or sort of worth the effort to abstract this all away, because you lose a lot in the abstraction. And he's got a conversation going on Twitter with some people talking about it as well. I'll link all of this stuff below the video so that everyone watching can get involved. But anyways, I would say still try this out because it's a really cool concept, but those were the issues and sort of the conclusion that I came up with. Thank you very much for watching this video. Hope you guys and girls are doing well. Have a great day. Stay safe and healthy. Bye.